So welcome to this plenary lecture, public lecture of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. The title is Unknowns in Heaven and Earth, Mystery, God and the Limits of Science. Very pleased to welcome two heavy hitters in the world of science and culture who've managed to combine a lifetime of scholarship with an ability to communicate to the public and regard this as a very important part of their work. So the format of this evening is, first of all, I'm going to invite each of them in turn to speak for about 20 minutes or so, setting out some of their key ideas. Then we're going to have a little conversation at the front here. I'm going to suggest a few leading questions, and hopefully we'll get them into dialogue with one another. And then we'll have a session of Q&A. And we plan to finish on time at 8:45. So our first speaker is Marcelo Gleiser, and I'll just give you a few snippets from his background. He's an Appleton Professor of Natural Philosophy and a Professor of Physics and Astronomy at Dartmouth College. He obtained his Ph.D. from King's College London and received the 1994 Presidential Faculty Fellows Award from the White House. He is a Fellow of the American Physical Society. His books have been published in 15 languages and include The Island of Knowledge, The Limits of Science and the Search for Meaning, A Tear at the Edge of Creation, and The Simple Beauty of the Unexpected. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed articles, essays, and op-eds, and frequently participates in TV documentaries and radio shows in the United States and abroad. He's the co-founder of a very influential blog for National Public Radio in the States on science and culture. The title of the blog is 13.7, indicating the age of the universe. And it was set up to enable scientists to talk about science and culture to the public in broad terms, and been very successful. And Professor Gleiser also directs the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth College. So would you please welcome Professor Gleiser, and I invite him to speak for 20 minutes, setting out his case. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for having me here and for having the opportunity to talk to Alister a little bit about these very important and ponderous questions. And thank you all for coming as well. So, as Andrew said, I am a theoretical physicist by training, and that's what I tend to do most of my time. But in being a theoretical physicist, it occurred to me that the reason why I do this is because I'm really interested in questions of origins that relate to, say, the origin of the universe and the origin of life. And the funny thing about this is that we have a distorted, widespread view of science in which we believe that science is able to address these questions completely, that such questions are now part of the scientific discourse in such a way that it's just a matter of time. Sooner or later, we'll be able to understand these things. And of course, when I was younger, I was very excited about that prospect because, after all, that's a wonderful thing. You know, we all are engaged in trying to understand the basic questions of existence. And if science could do that, all the better, right? Because you would have this sort of credibility of the scientific discourse and methodology to kind of address things that we have always wanted to know, right? And so as I started to, of course, become a practicing scientist and to learn more about this, I realized that the reality was much subtler than that, that it's not so easy to actually come to understand such questions. And in fact, that in the practice of science itself, you encounter limits in the way we deal with such things that are very much part of the way science functions. So in the very practice of becoming a scientist and trying to understand these very deep questions of origins, I call them the three origins: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of mind. It sort of became clearer as you begin to think about this and as you begin to learn, not just from a scientific perspective, but other people that have been thinking about these questions for many, many years, way before scientists have, you know, from a religious background and from a philosophical background, that these questions cannot be answered by one specific way of thinking alone, right? And just to give you a brief example, the question of the origin of the universe, right? Now, you may have seen in the public press that some scientists make declarations. And by the way, I'm a cosmologist. So what I do is study the evolution of the universe, right? So some very eminent scientists, in fact, have made public declarations, written books saying that we have figured out how the universe came to be, you know. And how do you do that? Well, you know, you apply certain laws of quantum mechanics and certain laws of general relativity. You use the fact that energy is conserved, and lo and behold, you come up with a model where the universe comes out of nothing, ex nihilo, right? Well, it's not ex nihilo, and that is just almost an embarrassing point, you know, from a scientific perspective for me to see some of my colleagues say these things, because in order to construct a narrative that describes the origin of the universe, you have to presuppose a whole conceptual framework of how science actually is working. So you have to talk about the foundations of quantum mechanics. You have to talk about the laws of general relativity, you know, the Einstein's theory of how space is bent by matter. You have to talk about conservation laws. And so you have to basically use the whole conceptual framework of science to come up with a model, which has not been verified at all, that explains incompletely how the universe could have appeared from a quantum fluctuation, right? So this nothing is a very charged nothing. You know, there is no such thing as nothing in quantum physics. And so the point is that such assertions that, yes, we scientists can figure out or have figured out the question of the origins of the universe are just wrong. They're just false. And that's a confusing thing, because people read this, right? They'll buy the books and they'll read this and they'll go, wow, you know, now science really has nailed it, because perhaps the most difficult question we can ask is the question of the first cause, right? What is the cause that caused everything else and by itself is not caused, right? And that is a question that has stunned all thinkers, right? From the beginning of what we call recorded history, so much so that if you go to every different religion, you're going to see that pretty much all of them, or most of them, have some narrative of creation, right? A creation myth, a story that tells how the world came to be and how people and nature came to be with the world or after, depends. You know, there are many, many different kinds of ways in which you can frame that story, right? And so the problem, though, is in the religious sense, what has happened is that all of these narratives, they start with what we can call an absolute power, right? A power that transcends the boundaries of space and time, because obviously if you're going to create space and time, you better transcend it, right? You have to be beyond that. And so this sort of a power that is beyond the laws of nature, so to speak, is kind of implicitly accepted by these narratives. Science can, and even before you go to science, if you go to Aristotle, right? So Aristotle, in his model of the universe, he talked about every motion being caused from the outside in by the so-called unmoved mover. So even though Aristotle, people think, was one that would ban the gods from philosophy or from a narrative of nature, actually his unmoved mover was essentially a deity that had the power of producing, causing those first motions without itself having been caused by anything, right? Because we just get stuck on the question of the first cause, right? And this has been the case, and it continues to be the case, and I only have like 20 minutes, so I can't go on for very long about this, but I just want to give you an idea of some questions which you can frame within the scientific discourse that nevertheless cannot be explained within the scientific discourse alone. You can create a narrative that describes as best as we can the history of the universe from the very, very first moments after the Big Bang, which is our accepted theory of cosmology these days. But as you try to push the clock backwards to the very beginning, you really get stuck. At least we are very much stuck at this point. You know, and then you have different competing narratives, and because we don't have any empirical evidence to back one or the other, we just don't know, right? And I think one thing that is lacking perhaps in this discussion with the scientists is that there is a lack of humility in basically accepting the way it works. So in order to make sense of this, and the same with the origin of life. So another work that I spent some time is trying to figure out how could life appear from non-life in the early Earth, right? So we're talking about 4.5 billion years ago, Earth formed with the sun and the planets, and at least 3.5 billion years ago, you had the first kinds of living creatures here. So how did you go from inorganic chemistry to biochemistry to living biochemistry, right? So this non-life, it's called abiogenesis. And this is another jump that we don't quite know. And even if you could simulate the origin of life or recreate a living creature from an abiogenic initial condition in the laboratory, you could not know for sure that that was the way it happened here on Earth. Unless you could prove a theorem that would tell you that there is only one or very few biochemical pathways to go from non-life to life, you just don't know if what you can do in the laboratory here is what happened on Earth. So there is another very simple, very fundamental question about origins that you can frame within a scientific conceptual understanding that you cannot really know for sure of what's going on, right? And so thinking about these things, I came up with an idea which that I call the island of knowledge, which is the following. That if you think of the knowledge that we have accumulated about the natural world has fit in an island, and this size of this island is growing in time, even though sometimes we make mistakes, and the history of science is full of wonderful and illuminating and very inspiring mistakes about people trying to figure out things and coming up with notions that were proven wrong, but those steps were fundamental to get to the right answer in the end. So for example, the nature of heat, right? What is heat, right? So people talked about something called the phlogiston, which is this substance which was very mysterious, and then after that came the caloric, and then eventually came the idea that heat is really a form of motion. But to get to there, we had all these invisible substances that we came up with to try to make sense of what was going on in the laboratory. So the island of knowledge, even though we make mistakes, we can correct them. So this island grows. But as with any good island, right, this island is also surrounded by an ocean, right? And I call that the ocean of the unknown, the stuff we don't know about the world, right? And some optimists, some people call them, there is a word for this now, it's called scientism, says that essentially the island is just going to keep on growing and growing and growing until there is just no more ocean whatsoever. We're covered, and that's it. There is no more unknowns, and we're done. We can go retire and play golf or something. And the point is that that is just incorrect, profoundly incorrect, because the very, very core of science generates ignorance. So the way it works is that as the island is growing into this ocean of the unknown, so are the shores of our ignorance, right? Because the more you know, the bigger the boundaries between the known and the unknown. And this is a theme that repeats itself in the history of science consistently. So just to give you an idea, think about the history of astronomy before and after the telescope. Right? So before the telescope, 1609 or so, astronomy was all naked eye, and you could see some things, and you could measure things with some precision. Tycho Brahe did some spectacular measurements naked eye with his instruments, but that was only you could only go so far. And then Galileo and then others pointed the telescope to the sky, and the whole notion of what is the universe and where do we live in this universe and how do we relate to the things that happen in this universe changed profoundly because of that instrument, right? And so what happens is that as knowledge progresses, you become equipped to ask questions that you couldn't even have dreamed about before, right? These are new questions that you just could not have framed because you didn't have the conceptual basis to even think about them. The microscope is another example, right? Same 17th century, amazing century, for science, right? There is van Leeuwenhoek invents the microscope, and then suddenly what is life becomes a completely different question, right? How small can life be, you know? How small a creature can it be that is still alive? And what dictates that, right? And so that means that as we progress, instead of having less questions to ask, we have more questions to ask, right? And that has been the bread and butter of science. Now, some people think that this is kind of a defeatist view. You know, they feel like depressed. What's the point? You know, if we're going to spend all this energy trying to figure things out, and the more we know, the more questions we keep having to ask, so that's just terrible. Well, I profoundly disagree with that. I think that's exactly what the fun is. It's exactly because we're always having to ask questions that the engagement with nature is so important and so gratifying, right? So otherwise, the point would be we'll get to the end of things and then what, right? Very boring, right? As Tom Stoppard said, you know, it's wanting to know that makes us matter. And I think this engagement with nature is fundamental. But also in the metaphor of the island, there is something else hidden in there. Because there is this ocean of the unknown, right? And then spread around in this ocean of the unknown, there are the regions which are called the unknowables. You know, the questions that we just cannot figure out using science, right? And so if you want to color that in a more theological way, you could say that we are surrounded by mystery and that science feeds on this mystery. You know, it progresses because it's an engagement with this sense of the mysterious, right? And Einstein said something very similar to that. He called it the cosmic religious feeling or something like that, which was this engagement of the human mind with what we do not know. And to him, this devotion to this mysterious was a religious devotion, you know, in a pure sense of the word. You know, he believed that it is this mysterious sense of not knowing and of engaging with what we don't know that is at the cradle of what human creativity is all about, both in the sciences and the arts. So, you know, humans are very perplexed creatures, right? Because we are aware of what we are, and we are a very strange thing because we are a thinking animal. And there are no other thinking animals for us to, so, you know, with apologies to dolphins and whales and my dog, you know, we are different from those guys, right? I mean, they may be very smart, but they're not writing poetry or building radio telescopes, right? It's a very different kind of intelligence, so to speak, right? And so we have this, and we have this tension between being an animal, aware of our own mortality, right? And being semi-godlike, for being able to ponder these big questions of existence, right? And it's a complicated deal. It's a tough deal to be a human in that sense, right? Because we have to understand that we have our intelligence and our creativity to deal with these fundamental questions, and yet a lot of them have no answers. So what do you do, right? So what do you do with the fact that you know that some of these questions have no answers? Well, that is a very personal question, right? And people choose to answer it in very different ways. So I answer it in one way. Alister probably answers in a different way. And I think it's very important that the people that address and think about these issues sit together and talk in a constructive way about the different ways of making meaning of life, right? So here's my way, right? So I'm an agnostic. So I'm not an atheist, because to me, the definition of atheism goes against the scientific method. In fact, it's inconsistent with the scientific method, right? Whatever the science, there are ways in which you can think about the scientific method, but if you just go old-fashioned and say it's about evidence, well, it turns out that, if you take a radical atheist approach, it really is belief in non-belief. That's what it is. It's belief in non-belief. And scientifically, you just can't do that. You just cannot categorically rule out something without having evidence in that support. So what you can do is you can say, I have no support in my life or in my way of thinking to believe in this or that, but I cannot rule out this or that, at least given the evidence. So at least I keep an open mind for whatever comes out, or for possibly a change of thinking, of ways of thinking later in life, who knows. But the point is that for that reason, I'm agnostic. So you say, oh, does that mean that he has no spirituality in his life? And the answer is absolutely no. I consider myself a very spiritual person. But where is that coming from then? Well, I feel it comes from precisely this engagement with nature, with the engagement with not knowing, with the mysterious. To me, being out there in the woods, in the forest, in the world, is a way of worshiping. Because one thing that I learned from cosmology and from astrophysics is that we are all part of the universe in a very deep sense. We carry within our bodies the history of the whole universe. Right? So all this stuff that we're made of, as Carl Sagan said very famously, right, came from stars. And it came from stars that are much older than the sun itself. So within us, we carry history, a cosmic history, which is before the sun even existed. Now, to me, that's profoundly awesome in the right sense of the word. And to me, that fills myself with a sense of deep spirituality when I understand these things and I realize that I can engage with these things to a certain extent, even if not completely, by knowing all the answers to the questions we can ask, right? So then what do? What about the stuff you don't know? I embrace ignorance, and I'm okay with that. You know, it's okay not to know. It's okay not to have all the answers, as long as you don't give up asking questions to kind of increase your island of knowledge. And I found my peace that way. And I think my 20 minutes are over. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gleiser. And our next speaker is Alister McGrath, the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion here at the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford. He's also Professor of Divinity at Gresham College. His main research interest at present is the area of thought traditionally known as natural theology, a theme of his Gifford lectures at the University of Aberdeen in 2009 and his Halcyon lectures at the University of Cambridge. A former atheist, he is also known for his opposition to new atheism and his advocacy of theological critical realism. Among his best-known books are The Twilight of Atheism, The Dawkins Delusion, Dawkins' God, Genes, Memes, and the Meaning of Life, and A Scientific Theology. Please welcome Professor McGrath.
Well, Andrew, thank you for that welcome, and thank you for an excellent talk. And in many ways, I'm reflecting on very similar themes, maybe in a different way, but again, it just shows how interesting and important these themes are. I go back to my youth when I began to get interested in science, and I remember looking at the night sky when I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. I think I would have used the word mystery to refer to what I was seeing. It felt big, but for me, the word mystery meant something like a puzzle. This is something we can master. This is something we can solve. And when I began to do science properly as a teenager, I think that was really my sense, that science was something which was able to deliver secure answers, which were stable, and therefore, in effect, was constructing a mental world, which in effect was invariant and secure. I look forward to inhabiting it. And I think I began to read some people who seemed to say things that irritated me. Bertrand Russell, for example. Many of you will have read his History of Western Philosophy. It's not actually a very good book, but the preface is very interesting. Because he says, maybe the task of philosophy is to teach us to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by despair. You think about that. As a scientist who was beginning to think that science solves all our big problems, I thought this is someone who really needs to study some science. And I kind of just dissed Bertrand Russell, saying this man doesn't quite know what the right time of day is, and moved on. But I want to try and make a point which I think is very important, and that is actually the way science is taught in schools. Because the way I was taught science, in effect, is here is a body of knowledge. Sure, here's how it's derived, but now we've derived it. Learn this. This is the way things are. And there was this sense that this was a deliverance. Something was absolutely secure, and science, therefore, was about this body of knowledge. And there have been a lot of articles by people like Jonathan Osborne and so on really worrying about this, because as I now know, science is a method which is a wonderful method, but whose outcomes will vary over time as we secure, hopefully, a greater traction on reality. And the real difficulty there is that we can look back on scientific history, as Marcelo has just done with us. We look back to calorific, we look back to the idea of a permanent, stable, eternal universe, and we say, that's what they thought then, we know better now. But there is a sense in which the history of science is asking us to do something really quite unsettling. It's almost asking us to conduct an imaginative experiment in which we step forward by 50 years and invite ourselves to look back at where we are now and ask how many of the things that we now think are right will be categorized as that's what they thought in 2018, we know better now. In other words, science is on a journey, and that journey is not yet completed. Now, of course, this is a very, very normal line of thought to take. You find it, for example, in Michael Polanyi's works, but it's a real issue. And that is how on earth, as scientists, we can cope with saying something like this. I believe that at the moment this is a very good account of the way science sees the world, but I have to take into account that some of these ideas will change, and I'm not quite sure which will be the ones that do change. And of course, Polanyi's problem is how can you, with intellectual integrity, hold on to that? In effect, saying, I trust this, but I know some of it isn't right or isn't adequate, and you're not absolutely sure which bits are like that. So for me, I think that's a really important point, learning to live with that uncertainty, but almost being prepared to embrace it and say, this is the way things are. We have to learn to live with this. And the question, therefore, is how we're able to develop cognitive mechanisms to allow us to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by hesitation. And that brings me back to Bertrand Russell. I mean, I was an atheist as a young man, and I knew Bertrand Russell was an atheist, but as I shifted myself towards a more Christian way of thinking and read Bertrand Russell more closely, I began to realize that Bertrand Russell was really more interesting than I'd thought. Because that maxim, learning to live with uncertainty without being paralyzed by hesitation, Russell was absolutely clear he was an epistemological agnostic. He was also an atheist, but he made it very clear that his atheism was in effect a lifestyle choice. I cannot prove this to be right, but I embrace it. In other words, he was being absolutely consistent in saying, this is something I cannot prove to be right, but I choose to live this way. Choosing to live with uncertainty, if you like, because he could not prove that that was right. And that does seem to me to be a really quite interesting perspective. And so it causes me to ask very much the same question, which is how on earth we can begin to, in effect, rejoice in science, while at the same time accepting provisionality and change, and also beginning to open up the relationship of science with other disciplines. So Marcelo mentioned Einstein towards the end of his talk. I think I will pick up on Einstein because he's a very good example. Because Einstein was clearly a very good scientist, but he also was a living human being who in effect was interested in more than science. And so suppose we think about Einstein's politics. If you read his essay on socialism from 1942, he's absolutely clear this is the best political system. He's very clear this is where he locates himself. But he's also very clear, I can't prove this is right. This is what I think is right. This is what I'm committed to. And if you think about that, how does that rationality correlate with what seems to be a very different rationality that we see in his engagement with questions of natural science. Or again, you think of Einstein's religion. Einstein's religion is perhaps a little bit more complicated than we would like, but certainly he is perhaps an example of someone who sees in Spinoza's idea of God something that is scientifically manageable and perhaps even useful. So he sees religion as being very, very important potentially, because science may help us understand how things work, but we also want to know what they mean. And indeed, Einstein, in that very famous lecture on science and religion he gave at Princeton in 1939, says that we have this slight problem, which is that actually the motivation to make us want to live well actually is not really provided by science itself. We need more than that. So again, we have a scientist with a rationality in that area, a politician with rationality in that area, and also a man who is religious with his own rationality. And those are three different rationalities. How can he hold them together? You'll say this is a matter of psychology, and I think you're right. But nevertheless, it raises again this question that Marcelo has raised about this island of knowledge. Because we are human beings who, many of us are also scientists, but we all think. And the issue really is how we feel we can inhabit this world and live with its uncertainties while still actually trying to make sense of it and saying, I know I cannot prove this, but this seems to me to be the best way of doing it, and I'm going to keep on doing this until, in fact, someone shows me there is a better way. Now, that, I think, is a very interesting line of thought, which could be developed in many ways. But here's the point I'm going to make now, and it's this. I'm going back to that notion of mystery, with which I began this brief talk. I was looking at the night sky, and as I was saying, it's a puzzle, we can solve this. But I was also very conscious, here is something that is actually slightly overwhelming. I feel very, very small in the presence of something so vast. And that, I think, is a very important theme. And so maybe we need to just keep this word mystery on the table. Not run away from it, but saying, look, this is interesting. A number of philosophers recently, I think of Ian Kidd and Nottingham, but there are many others as well, John Cottingham, have said, in effect, that a receptivity towards mystery creates a sort of predisposition to be much more open-minded about the world. What they're saying, in effect, is a recognition we are never going to secure complete total comprehension of our world makes us much more willing to engage in an open-minded way. Now, I find that an interesting thought, because for me now, the word mystery would mean something like this. The universe is so large, so vast. And while we do have certain cognitive capacities, they might have evolved for a purpose, which in effect is about survival, not for actually being able to understand this vast cosmos in which we live. And so for me, the question really is being prepared to admit that there are going to be limits to what we can fully understand, and that we have to live with this very great pressure from a vast universe, which in some ways overwhelms us. Now, I'm Irish, and I quite like reading John Banville, who won the Booker Prize some years ago for his novel, The Sea. But in an earlier set of novels, 3 novels, he wrote about Copernicus, Kepler, and Newton. And in fact, he used this trilogy of novels to explore the changing shape of the scientific method and the changing expectations about what science could deliver. I'm not saying Banville is right, he's a novelist. But in an interview with the New York Times, he talked about how, as he looked at the progression of science and the changing expectations people had, he saw, his words, a transition from Cartesian certainty to Wittgensteinian despair. I think that's an overstatement. But nevertheless, there is something there. There's something there about recognizing there's going to be limits to what we can know and asking whether we can live with that. And so in many ways, I think the questions that Marcelo opened up, this very powerful image of the island of knowledge, really is partly about what science is, partly about what knowledge is, but I think it focuses very much on each of us as we wrestle with this question of how we can meaningfully inhabit this world, knowing that the things that really matter to us actually are sometimes things that we can't actually show to be right, and how we live with that tension. In effect, saying, I think it's right, but I can't prove it's right, but nevertheless I'm acting on its basis and trying to see that as a meaningful area of inhabitation. So going back to that idea of mystery, it does seem to me that the word mystery does say something very powerful about our universe, but also about ourselves as cognitive agents. And in effect, it is inviting us just to be receptive to the idea that there may be limits to what we can understand about our universe. The question of origins, I think, is an excellent question, because I was reading an essay by Steven Weinberg, and in effect he was talking about the limits of scientific explanation. He says, look, we may be able to say, we get back to these fundamental constants of nature, and then we find that's where our explanatory buck stops, because we can use those constants to explain lots of things this side of them, but on the far side of them, why are they there? Well, actually, we're stuck. Now, I'm sure there'll be rival positions offered within this audience tonight, but I think he is putting his finger on something that really is important. So, of course, I then come to a more religious side of things, and this is where I think there is something interesting that needs to be said more theologically. And I'll just say this very briefly, because I want us to open up a very good discussion. But for me, in theology, there is this tension, a very creative, a very important tension, between being able to understand something and at the same time finding ourselves overwhelmed by something that's so big for us. And if I could put it like this, maybe in the case of Christianity, I can't speak for any other faith, but this will just get our discussion going. We talk about one aspect of it, theology being, here is something we think we can make sense of, that we can work with this. This seems to be an area where we can begin to pin things down a bit. And yet, we know it's much bigger than that. And actually, on the one hand, there is this understanding. But on the other hand, there's being overwhelmed by the sense that if God is what God is, then we cannot conceivably take that in. And that's what Christian theologians really mean by that word glory, the weightiness, the ponderousness of God. In other words, we are overwhelmed because God is so vast. And so if you like, there's a very interesting tension between doing theology and doing worship. Because in many ways, worship is opening us up to something that's so vast that our response is really to get on our knees. Whereas theology is saying we can try and make at least some sense of that. And maybe that tension helps keep those two in balance. Not going off into vague fuzziness, but at the same time realizing that sharp conceptual definitions actually are sharper than they ought to be. And we've got to try and create space for that. So back to Marcello's image of the island of knowledge. I think it's a wonderfully creative thing. And again, I go back to my own period as a teenager. I mean, it's a wonderful image. Here's this island getting bigger. One day the sea will disappear. And Marcello's very wise response to that, no. The more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know. That actually the island may grow, but what lies beyond it grows also. And so really the question I hope we'll discuss a little bit tonight is how we live with that tension. The tension between being aware that we can make so much sense of things, and yet at the same time, there is so much that A, remains inaccessible, even unknowable to us. But at the same time, some things that we think we do know may prove to be rather more tentative and provisional than we think. Much more I could say, but that's just really to get our discussion underway. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much to both our distinguished speakers. I'm going to invite them now to come and sit in these hot seats, so to speak, and going to ask a few questions to get the discussion going, but I'm also hoping they're going to engage with one another, and then open it up to any of your questions. So, just go back a little bit to my own history here. I was a particle physicist here in the 80s, and there was a lot of excitement at the time. It was a very heady time in European particle physics. After the W and Z bosons, we were building the Large Electron-Positron Collider, and people were talking about grand unified theories. And there was the Platonic dream of a mathematization of everything, that we were just on the verge. And I know you've both given some thought to this, particularly Professor Gleiser. Would you like to comment a little bit about grand unified theories, at least for physical reality? Are these promising? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's funny. So two physicists and you're a chemist. Right. Okay. Interesting. All right. Well, so the idea is I'm sure a lot of you know, but just to make sure we have some basis here, is that as we understand nature today, at least in the world of the very small, the world of particles and the particles that make up the nuclei of atoms and the electrons, there are only four fundamental forces of nature. There is gravity that we're all very familiar with because everything falls. There is electromagnetism that we're also familiar with because we interact with light and different kinds of radiation and magnetism all the time. And then there are two other forces that we are not familiar with but are extremely important, which are the strong and the weak nuclear forces, right? So the strong force is the force that if you start asking about the nucleus of the atoms, you immediately realize that, wait, there's something very funny going on, because if the nucleus is made of protons and neutrons, and protons are positively charged and same charges repel one another, how come the protons, the nucleus stick together? And the reason for that is there is another force, there's an attractive force, which is about 100 times more powerful than this electric repulsion between protons, which is the strong nuclear force, right? So without that, there will be no nuclei, there will be no atoms. And then there is a fourth force, which is the weak nuclear force, which is responsible for radioactivity, for radioactive decays, and is also fundamental in the way that stars make their own energy by fusion. So whenever you have hydrogen atoms at the core of the sun fusing into helium, they release a huge amount of radiation. Some of that radiation is in the form of neutrinos, which are particles that travel almost at the speed of light. Talking about mystery, so here you go. Right now, at every second, there are about 1 trillion neutrinos coming from the heart of the sun going through your body. Every second, 1 trillion. That's 1 with 12 zeros. And we have no clue that this is happening. So as Saint-Exupéry said in The Little Prince, the invisible is essential to the eye, right? So there you go. This is the point. No, what is invisible is essential, even if you cannot see it, right? And so in particle physics is really the art of making the invisible somewhat visible indirectly, right? So the point is that those four forces apparently are very different. But physicists like to have simplistic explanations, and they try to bring together as much as they can into a single theory. In fact, the whole concept of a beautiful theory, and I think it was Weinberg that said that, and Frank Wilczek, another Nobel Prize, says that a beautiful theory is like a Mozart symphony. You cannot take a single note out without destroying the integrity of the whole thing. And so to have a beautiful theory as a physicist, you try to create, and this, of course, is a theoretical prejudice, by the way. You try to create a unified description where all four forces are really manifestations of a single one, the unified theory of everything. So if you look deeper into the nature of things, you start to see those forces acting in more and more similar ways, so that at a very, very, and by deeper I mean at higher energies, so that at a very, very high energy, those forces would be indistinguishable from one another. There will be just one force. Now, do we have any evidence for this? Well, the whole history, I don't want to go too long, but the whole history of physics has talked about unification. So Newton, for example, unified the physics of the earth and the physics of the sky with gravity, saying that the same force that makes an apple fall makes the moon go around the earth. And then electricity and magnetism became unified with electromagnetism. And so the tendency is to try to find that. And now there is the electroweak unification, which is bringing together electromagnetism and the weak force, which is not quite a true unification for technical reasons you can ask me later. But the idea of grand unification is that if you go to energies which are about 1 trillion times bigger, 12 orders of magnitude bigger than what we can see nowadays with our machines, all three forces, the strong, the weak, and the electromagnetic force, would behave in the same way. Right? So there'll be a force of nature. And then if you push things a little further, another 3 or 4 orders of magnitude, gravity would jump into the bandwagon, and you have a single force of nature. So that's the goal. That's the dream of unification, right? And talking about Weinberg again, of course, he has a book called Dreams of a Final Theory, which tells the story of how people are trying to do this in a very hard way, right? Which brings me to what's going on with that dream. This is a very old dream. So grand unification is from like 1974. And then string theories, which are theories that try to bring gravity into the scheme, from the 80s and 90s. And of course, up to now, we have zero evidence that these unifications are actually happening, right? Which brings a very interesting point, which is this: we're talking about 40 years here, in which predictions made by these theories have not been verified by experiments. And so there is a tension, very big tension going on in the particle physics community, which is, should we declare such ideas wrong and move on and look for other things? Or should we pursue them and just try to tweak the parameters of the theory so that we can hide them in the current experiments? It would need much bigger machines to try to test them. So at what point you declare a theory wrong? And that is a question that there is no obvious answer to that. And it really becomes a matter of taste and a matter of attitude with respect to unknowns, right? And I have a bet with one of the big proponents of supersymmetry that a fellow called Gordon Kane, that by the end of 2018, if no supersymmetric particle is found in the LHC, he has to give me a 15-year-old ball of McCallum. So I'm almost there.
Anything at all?
I'll say a few words. I mean, I find this fascinating. I suppose part of what he wants to say is it scientific to dream of a final theory, or is it actually a philosophy of nature that's saying it has to be like this? In other words, are we being driven by something deep within us, which actually is almost like a primal instinct? There has to be something, has to be this holy grail. And what I'm wondering is, if we're having such difficulty finding it, do we have to ask whether actually there might be a plurality of grails? We have to learn to live with that. Or whether actually we will find our way there one day. And I think that people like Nancy Cartwright are suggesting that we have to learn with this dapple universe, that sort of thing. I mean, my own feeling is that you can see why people want to do this very strong belief that there has to be this fundamental point of convergence. And yet, as someone who loves reading about the history of science, I'm a skeptic, probably for all the wrong reasons. It's just that I've seen how the history goes, how a dream of something actually doesn't work out. And actually, it's a productive failure, because when a dream fails, a new dream arises, and maybe it's a better dream this time. So I'm looking forward to seeing where we go in the next 25 years. So if you get your bottle of whiskey, that's going to really open up a great discussion.
Especially after I drink it. Can I make a comment on this? So to what extent do you think it would be attractive for, say, Jewish and Christian theologians to have Sir theory realized?
It will be very attractive, right, but not necessarily for the right reasons. I mean, I think that there is this very strong sense that if you have some sort of theistic perspective, then actually, that if I can crudely call it an ontological unity of nature, would seem to point towards some theory being able to grasp that. And again, why I'm saying I'm expressing skepticism here is not because I don't believe in God or anything like that. It's much more because I've become more and more aware of the limits to our understanding. And therefore, I'm concerned that we might end up forcing thing into some kind of preconceived theoretical mold, whereas the data itself doesn't really encourage that. But again, you know, we're moving, and let's see where we get to.
Okay.
Thank you to both of you. When we were having a few discussions before the talks began, the issue of transhumanism came up, and actually it's the theme of our Ian Ramsey Centre Summer Conference. I put in an advert for that. But Professor Gleiser, you said that we're already transhumanist in a certain sense. We'd like to comment on this.
Yeah, so that's something completely different, right? I mean, that's so another Irish fellow, just called Mark O'Connell, wrote a book, which I just saw they sell at Blackwell's. We just got the what prize? The Welcome Prize? The Welcome, what's it called? Yeah, literary prize here in the UK. And the book is brilliant. It's called To Be a Machine, Cyborgs, Transhumanists, and Other People Trying to Solve the Problem of Death. The Small Problem of Death. That's the subtitle. And so what he did is he's a humanist. He's a literary critic, really. And he went to travel around both in the UK and the United States with people that believe they are transhumans. And so what does that mean? So it means that technology is advancing in such a way that we humans are not what we used to be anymore, but we're really hybrids with kinds of technologies that we depend on completely, right? And so just to give a very prosaic example, our cell phones, right? I mean, we have a very deep relationship with our cell phone to the point that pretty much the first thing you do when you wake up is, if you're not being waken up by the telephone, is you go and you look and you check the weather, you check your email, you check other things, and you need that machine close to you. If you forget it and you go to work and you don't have it, you're going to have a very bad day, because you're going to be disconnected from reality as you have fabricated through that machine, you know, through Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is. And even better than that, if you look at everyone here must have a cell phone, or mostly. And if you look at them, they will have lots of the same apps. However, each one of us will have a very specific collection of apps in your cell phone, because the cell phone becomes an extension of who you are. And the choices of apps that you make really depend on what you believe in and what you like and how you connect with other people. So they're already a sort of digital fingerprint of your personality. So we are extending our minds, our presence in the world through a machine already. And the tendency is just going to become bigger and bigger. And so the point is, will we get to something that we are not going to be human anymore, but we're going to be a completely new species, you know, with this integration between machines and humans? Or the other way of thinking about this is, if you develop artificially intelligent, true artificial intelligence, strong AI machines, will that be the end of the human race as we know it? And right here at Oxford, you have Nick Bostrom, who is someone that has been thinking a lot about these things.
I think one of the things Nick Bostrom's talking about is, in effect, one of the limits of human nature. I mean, human nature as it stands is a bit defective, so we can do better than this. And of course, you can't really create eternal life, but you can extend life. And I found myself reading Nick, and I'm thinking, supposing we all live to 500 years old. And of course, we've all read Thomas Malthus. So we know if we all live to 500 years old, what is that going to do to the water supply? What's that going to do to the food supply? And Malthus is saying it's either famine or it's war. And to me, that's quite a frightening thought, I'm afraid. But a more amusing thought is John Gray's wonderful book, The Immortality Commission. For those of you who haven't read this, John Gray is a wonderful philosopher at the London School of Economics. And he takes the example of Lenin's mausoleum in Moscow. And he says, look, Marxism, Leninism felt it could change the world, and therefore it should be able to, in effect, bring about some sort of immortality. And the problem was, when Lenin was mummified, so to speak, they discovered he began to rot. And so they had to kind of do all these surgical techniques to preserve his body, and he kept on rotting more and more. It's a wonderful book, I mean, but the point he's trying to make is there is this dream of achieving immortality. And what, again, I found myself wondering is, what's wrong with dying? I mean, it's one of these things that actually I think we do need to think about. And I'm ready to go when it's right.
Just like to pick up something from that discussion, but also during the talks. You, Alister, said that seeing the night sky inspired you. Of course, we don't see the night sky much now. The old observatory is long since redundant here, and you have to really go a long way from our cities to see the heavens. What inspires you? What would you recommend? I'm thinking about experiences in the world, or great books, apart from your own, to open up the mind today, because in some ways we are being shut in Plato's cave, updated. So what would you recommend as an antidote?
Well, I think light pollution is a real problem. But I remember once traveling through the Iranian desert at night, and the bus broke down and we were stranded. And we were stranded in the midst of a black, silent landscape with the stars blazing down in brilliance. I have to say, I felt overwhelmed by that. And then I tried to tell my friends back home, as I'm trying to tell you now, what I experienced, and I could not do it. The words just did not do the job. And it's almost as if, it is recognizing the limits of language to convey something which really is significant and overwhelming. And that to me is very, very important. So, I mean, I don't say we all got into the Iranian desert. I mean, it might not be the best place to be at the moment. But, there are aspects of nature which I think really do generate that sense of wonder, which is, as Aristotle says, a sense of wonder is what makes you want to understand. And yet it's not reductive understanding, in the sense you're always aware that there's more to this than what you can express in words and theories. But nevertheless, there is an intellectual satisfaction in trying to figure out how this works, while retaining the sense this really is wonderful.
Yeah, I moved away from the big cities, and I live in the forest. And I think that was the best thing I've ever done in my life. And so to me, going, and not that I want to tell a lot about this, but I love trail running. And so to me, going to the mountains is essentially a form of worship. And it's interesting because in outside Kyoto, there's a sacred mountain that a sect of Buddhist monks, they run. And they run because they believe that the mountain is the body of the Buddha. And running there and exerting yourself and connecting in a very kind of fundamental level with the ground through this effort is a form of worship, And they've been doing this for many hundreds of years, and it's kind of an amazing thing. And so I think we should all find ways of reconnecting if we cannot. And here in Oxford, you're lucky enough that it's not very hard to find your little grove where you can go to, right? So it's just a matter of wanting to do it, and it's definitely worthwhile.
Well, thank you to both of you. We have about another 15 minutes before I want to bring it to a close. But I open it up now for questions from any of you. And perhaps you could just wait till the microphone reaches you. And maybe Maria could help me perhaps a little bit. Who's going to go first? First, Jen.
It does occur to me that most of the scientists I know, and I know quite a lot because I used to write about it, are very bad at philosophy of science. They don't even think about it. Some have contempt for it. It is also the case that science is usually taught without any serious reference to the philosophy of science. And it seems to me that leads to scientism, which in turn leads to hubris, which in turn can make science very dangerous. And I wondered if you agreed with that, and if you also agree that science, in fact, should never be taught in the absence of the philosophy of science, and should never be taught really without a sort of proper metaphysical framework. And it always is. In other words, something's got to be done.
Well, I'll begin to answer that question, because I think that's very interesting. When I was at high school, I just did straight science. And then I found myself with time on my hands, because I got a scholarship to Oxford, and that was done. So I had some months free, and I began to read books about the history and philosophy of science. And I have to say, they really, they told me things that I ought to have known but did not know. And my predecessor in this role, John Hedley Brooke, has written a very interesting article in which he talks about his own experience as someone longing to understand science who decided to do a Cambridge special paper on the history and philosophy of science. And in effect said, it was almost like becoming a heretic, because you realize that how provisional things were, how things were changing all the time, and actually how you had to live with that state of flux. And it really opened his eyes, but at the same time created a sort of healthy skepticism towards what were really rather overconfident statements. So I personally think that this does need to be part of it. I mean, I'm a carnivore, and that means I need to know how meat happens, okay? If you're a scientist, you need to know how science happens. And it's not a linear trajectory of absolutely untroubled progress. It zigzags. There are times of great progress, and it makes mistakes and corrects itself. But the problem is, when you're in the process, in the flux, you're not quite sure whether you're going right or going wrong. And very often, it's only from a later perspective you can answer that question. And so that to me, is really one of the things we've been talking about, uncertainty, maybe even humility, that we may not got right this time round, but hopefully they'll get better next time. But where does that leave us right now? I think that's a slightly troubling question, but I think it's a good perspective to stop us getting overconfident.
So just to comment on that, I think it's a failure of the educational system. I think it's a failure of the educational system because the way we're trained as scientists is we're basically technicians. We learned very well how to solve certain kinds of problems, in mechanics and electromagnetism, in physics, or if you go to biology, there are different Petri dishes that you can do. There are very specific methodologies that you thought and you learn how to do, but there's zero or almost zero historical or philosophical context of where are these stories coming from, where are these theories coming from, why are they created, when they were created, what kind of bigger questions were they supposed to be answering. And my experience in my university in the United States, which is what they call a liberal arts university, where scientists and non-scientists have to take courses that cross disciplines. So I teach a course there which is called the Physics for Poets class, which is physics for humanities students. And they absolutely love it because you teach science, especially physics and cosmology, as a history of ideas course. And so they talk about Newton, but they don't just talk about Newton's 3 laws of motion and gravity, but they talk about him being an alchemist and being interested in the biblical dating and spending more time doing these things than actually doing physics, and going against the Trinity, and the whole aspects of his life that you absolutely don't know. But once you put that together, you're enriching the education and not taking away. And this is I think, I may be wrong, and you may know this better than I do, I think this is a product of the Enlightenment, where there was a very sharp separation between, what was humanities and what was science, what was rational and what was not rational. And we sort of got stuck with that way of thinking, which I think only impoverishes the way scientists think about the world.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Lots of questions in my mind. I will try to ask only one. Maybe it will be a bit provocative. So what if I would ask you, both of you said in a way that there is a certain tension between acting and being paralyzed in the universe of uncertainty. So what if I say, when you said, for example, Marcelo, that you are okay with unknowing and still asking the questions, that you are either deceiving me or being more self-deceiving? Because, for example, I will say something very simple. I don't believe that you would still run if it wasn't good for your health. And to put it in a more metaphysical framework, one could argue that when you say that there is uncertainty, that also presupposes some kind of metaphysical reality of this uncertainty. For example, the same way island is surrounded by the ocean, also ocean is limited with the island. So there is some kind of metaphysical reality of this uncertainty. So if I'm saying that you are deceiving me, when you say, I can cope with this uncertainty and still ask the questions, what I'm really asking is, aren't we really admitting our boundaries when we choose one of the two options? First one is, I actually think there are answers. That's why I'm running. And I, as human being, I will find them. And the other option is, yes, I do believe in this metaphysical reality, the mystery, or something like that. So there is something like God. And both of them having different consequences in the reality.
So, great question. Well, the way I see it is that the fact that there are questions that we have no answers to, some of them are just because of the laws of nature. So for example, the speed of light is the fastest speed there is in nature, and that immediately, once you impose that in the way you think about the world, it immediately precludes you from understanding certain things or from knowing certain things. I'll give an example. The fact that the universe has a history, which is, from the Big Bang to nowadays, so 13.8 billion years, that means that light could only have traveled so far. It's about 45 billion light years away, which basically means that there is perhaps more universe beyond that, but I can never know. I cannot know what goes out there. So there is a very fundamental limit of understanding in the fact that the speed of light is an absolute limit of nature. That does not mean that I have to stop thinking about what could these other parts of the universe be like, even if I cannot have direct evidence of their existence. So you can still ask questions about things you don't know, and you have to, I think you have to separate the things that you don't know and things you can't know, right? The things that you don't know are the easy ones. That's what science is all about, right? We're always asking questions to expand. The things that you can't know, now that's where the metaphysics comes in, right? Because there's a huge debate right now in cosmology about if there is more universe out there beyond this bubble of information where we live, could this universe or perhaps other universes exist which would have different laws of nature from the ones that we have here, right? So that's a very important question, and is a question that possibly has no answer, because at least based on the laws of nature as we know them now, because if you can't get evidence from what's out there, how the heck are you going to decide if this multiverse exists or not? Well, but should you stop thinking about that just because of that? And that's where opinions diverge. Some say, of course you should, it's heresy, science is about empirical evidence. And others say, no, you should just push the envelope, and see what kind of ideas come in, because perhaps from our fantasies, we may be actually able to understand better some of the things that are happening within our universe right now, which is full of open questions like dark matter and dark energy and all these other mysteries of cosmology that we don't know. So embrace the not knowing, but don't give up on asking the questions, because there's always more to know. I'm totally fine with that. Now, that doesn't mean, you put in the word God right at the very end there, like a ping, like, and that's a little bit more of like, I think, at least I may have misunderstood you, but it may be more like the God of the gaps idea, which doesn't really take you very far.
Okay, I won't proceed.
Question back, yes.
Which one? Okay.
Just wait for the microphone so you can pick it up on the one.
It's been said that you touched on the idea of the theory of everything, and it's been said that God is the theory of everything. Do you find that a useful or unhelpful idea?
Is that you?
No, you start.
I wrote a book kind of criticizing this notion of theory of everything. So there is a very fundamental epistemological reason why there is no such thing. And the reason is the following. Given the fact that our knowledge of nature, scientific knowledge of nature, depends fundamentally on how we look at nature through our instruments, and the fact that our instruments are fundamentally limited in their range and precision, you can never know if what you call the theory of everything now is truly a theory of everything 100 years from now. Because I started that talk about unification with the 4 forces of nature. That's what we know now. But it is possible, for example, that within some of the particles that exist, like the Higgs, there is a 5th force of nature in there. We just don't have the power to see that. So, hey, I unified all forces of nature, I'm happy, I get the Nobel Prize, and then 100 years from now, the 5th force is discovered, and then boom, my theory of nature, my theory of everything is destroyed. So epistemological, only by thinking how science is a constructed narrative of reality, you have to rule out this whole notion of a theory of everything. It's just like as basic as that.
I'm wondering if we might make a distinction between a theory of everything and a way of holding things together coherently. Because I think that's actually quite an interesting point, because each scientific discipline, the disciplines are socially constructed, they arise in response to research questions. Each discipline uses its own methodology, it has its own distinct take on things. And the question is whether you have a whole series of little pictures, little snapshots, whether there is this bigger snapshot, this panorama, if you like, which lies behind that. Maybe you could think of the idea of God as the ground of coherence, not so much an explanation, but rather something that actually gives you the sense that things do hold together, even though our theories don't always help us to see that. And I'm sure you know this, but if you look at John Donne's very famous poem, The Anniversary, written in 1611, at a time when Donne is feeling these radical philosophies, these new scientific theories, they're in effect giving us a fragmented world where there are compartmentalizations, there's no unity. He's looking for something that holds things together. And maybe that's where you might think of God coming in, that there's this fundamental unity behind and under things. But not so much as a theory, I don't think that works, but certainly something more important than the theory, a sense that there's a half-glimpsed unity behind things, which maybe our scientific theories don't give us, but nevertheless we have to presuppose that in trying to theorize about our world.
We have time for one more quick question.
Being a scientist involves a leap of faith. We cannot prove anything, we can only falsify them. And then actually, in this excellent question before about scientists studying philosophy of science, actually it's kind of a hindrance, because as a scientist, you have to believe very strongly in what you're studying right now. Even if you were to study history of science, there's a 99% chance it's wrong. So being a scientist, we have to make leaps of faith all the time. But of course, we have to make leaps of faith in religion as well. To believe in God is a leap of faith, or a leap of faith that's required. I would be interested in both of your opinions about comparing the leap of faith that scientists have to make and the leap of faith we have to make to believe.
Wow. By the way, he's a leading quantum physicist.
Well, in that case, you will have a last word. You'll have a last word.
Okay.
I think this is a great question. I really do, because it's just bringing home to us that we're doing our best to try and get a handle on things. And it's provisional, it's moving ahead. I was reading a very interesting article by Anton Zeilinger and a few of his colleagues. They had this conference, was it in Vienna? And they did a little survey. Yeah, a little survey. I think there were 31 of them there, something like that. And which quantum theory do you think is right? Which is best? And actually, well, they were all over the place. It was really interesting, and the reasons for saying it's this or it's not anything at all or it's something else, I thought was really interesting, because these guys, I'm sure, were at the top of their field, but they were also very open to the uncertainties, the theoretical uncertainties there. And yet I don't think any of them were going home at night and lying awake all night worrying. I think they were just saying this is the way it is. And I think that is a very important point. I think faith is inevitable. I know that some people would say faith is antithetical to science, but I don't think that's right, because in effect you have to make judgments about how best to interpret evidence, and those judgments very often are made on the basis of criteria which emerge in the process of practice. In other words, they're not, laid down as here are the right theory, the criteria. They emerge as the scientific discipline proceeds. In fact, if you read the philosophy of science, very often you get the impression that people are looking at past scientific theories that were deemed to be successful and saying we'll use those criteria today because they seem to have worked then. But I personally don't have difficulty with what you're saying. I think that it's just the reality of the situation. I think what we need to do is say a leap of faith mainly, but is it a justified leap of faith? In other words, you recognize I am going beyond the evidence perhaps in saying this, but I think there is a good reason for doing so. I think that perhaps just postpones the question. But I think it's a very realistic question to say we need to be open to this, to the limits of evidence to actually compel us to say that is right when there are always other options available. And I suppose that what I'm really saying is that we may be able to find our ways to a right answer, but humility is a very important part of that process. Because very often, advance, whether it's in science or theology, is about listening to people who we think might be wrong, but they might not be. And it's by listening to them and taking them seriously that you begin to ask whether they might indeed be right.
Good. Yes, I think you're right. I think we first, we should distinguish between belief and faith, right? I think there is a difference. And we may have faith in a certain kind of belief. So, for example, we may believe that is a theory of everything, and then we go and we spend decades of our lives pursuing that. And even if we never get to that theory of everything, we'll find many, many interesting things along the way. And I think that's okay. So perhaps, especially when you're talking about big ideas, right? When you're talking about big ideas in the sciences, it's really, we're always pushing ahead of what we know. And in order to push ahead of what we know, we have to have some sort of guidance. And the guidance here is a mix of intuition and your own set of beliefs. You believe nature is in a certain way or works in a certain way. So should we reduce reality to information? Is it all based on information? Can we decode reality in terms of information theory? Well, 100 years ago, you couldn't even have been asking that kind of question or have that kind of image, right? So now some people say, of course, you have to define everything in terms of it from bit, and that is sort of like almost like a mantra that people say in order to create their own scientific legacy. So yes, you have to have that kind of faith. There's a fundamental difference, which I think happens here, which is in the end, you hope at least that in the scientific case, evidence is going to point towards or against your set of beliefs, and what you're going for, right? And the danger is that some of the questions we're asking now are so complex that you may spend your whole career going after them and die before you actually know. Right? And I think aging scientists tend to become quite desperate if that's the case. And that's when they become bad philosophers. Okay, that's it, I guess.
Just a few practical points. The talk, or once edited, will be on our YouTube channel, hopefully in a few days' time. To encourage you to also look at our Facebook page and also our website. We're getting working again for future videos. I'm particularly grateful to both our speakers. They're very busy. But particularly glad you've got to get on a transatlantic flight this morning and coming here to give a wonderful talk and event, joining us.
Pleasure.
We're very grateful for that.
Thank you.
Please thank our speakers.
Thank you.